Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us. It's a nice sunny but windy day here in California. I hope no one there is having bad weather, but we're grateful that you took this afternoon to join us. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Bedazzled Ink Authors Corner. My name is Liz Gibson, and I'm the author liaison, amongst other positions, with Bedazzled Ink Publishing. Today, we'll be hearing from two award-winning journalists who have independently reported on critical events that have shaped our knowledge of and influenced how America thinks about such things as the pharmaceutical industry, sex crimes in the Catholic Church, the events of 9/11, how 9/11 affected those who are at ground zero throughout the rest of their lives, and I'm sure there'll be many more topics. Allow me to give you a brief background on each of our guests, and then I'm going to just back away and let them talk away for the next hour on a few topics that we all think you might find interesting. Let me start with you, Catherine. Catherine Underhill Fitzpatrick started her journalism career as a feature writer and columnist at daily newspapers in Hannibal, St. Louis, and Milwaukee. In September of 2001, she happened to be in Manhattan to cover New York Fashion Week for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. But at first word of the terrorist attacks, she, of course, rushed to ground zero and filed real-time eyewitness reports back to Milwaukee. These reports have since been memorialized and are preserved for future generations. Catherine's articles, essays, and stories have appeared nationwide. She's written 4 published books: A Matter of Happenstance, Going on 9, Voyage, a memoir of love, war, and ever after, and Recorder of Deeds, Terrorism and Trauma, a journalist's life-changing choice on 9/11. Catherine has been interviewed on USA Today's Storyteller events and has interviewed such luminaries as Lauren Bacall, Leslie Stahl, and Gloria Steinem on live TV. For more about Catherine, please visit her website at cufitzpatrick.com. Alison Bass is an award-winning journalist and the author of 3 nonfiction books: Side Effects, a prosecutor, a whistleblower, and a best-selling antidepressant on trial; Getting Screwed, Sex Workers and the Law; and most recently, Brassy Broad, How One Journalist Helped Pave the Way to Me Too. The first one, Side Effects, received the prestigious National Association of Science Writers Science in Society Award, and its film rights have been optioned. Bass recently retired as Associate Professor of Journalism at West Virginia University. She was a longtime staff writer for the Boston Globe, and a series she wrote for the Globe was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in the public service category. Her articles and essays have also appeared in the Los Angeles Times, BuzzFeed, The Village Voice, Psychology Today, and numerous other media. For more on her credentials, please visit her website at alison-bass.com. But that's enough for me. You didn't come here to listen to me. Go on. Let's hear from Alison and Catherine. I want to start them off with a question, and then we'll see where that takes us from here. Alison, why don't I start with you? What would you say was your greatest contribution or story in your tenure in the world of journalism?
Well, I did a lot of writing when I worked for the Boston Globe and other newspapers. And I guess the 2 stories that I'm proudest of are the priest abuse scandal and the book I wrote about the pharmaceutical industry and how they corrupt and conflict medical researchers and make their drugs look safer and more effective than they really are. But I'll start, since the priest abuse scandal started sooner. It was it was an earlier story. When I was the first reporter at the Boston Globe to break a story about a priest who was accused of molesting dozens of boys and girls in the Fall River, New Bedford area. This was in 1992, and the Globe had never written anything about priest sexual abuse before this. And I remember it was late in the afternoon, and I got a call from an attorney that I knew, and he was representing 9 men and women who had accused a particular priest in the Boston Archdiocese of sexual abuse. And I had to write very quickly to meet deadline. I couldn't get anybody in the Boston Archdiocese to return my phone call. Finally, someone from the U.S. Catholic Bishops Association in New York returned the call and gave me a comment. And the story ran, I think, May 9th, 1992. And I remember coming into work the next day and there was just complete silence. Usually if I'd broken a big story, there was some congratulatory notes or emails, but this time there was silence. I think some of the top editors were shocked by the accusations. I wrote a few more stories and some other reporters joined me in doing different derivations of the story. And but it felt, being a Jewish reporter at the Boston Globe and writing about Catholic priests accused of molestation, I felt like I had a bullseye on my back, and it was pretty uncomfortable. And it was made even more uncomfortable when Cardinal Bernard Law called down the wrath of God on the Boston Globe for our reporting on Father Porter. But in June, Ben Bradley Jr., who was the Metro editor, decided that he wanted to assign 2 investigative reporters who could travel. I was at that point 7.5 months pregnant, and I couldn't go do much travel, and I was beginning to get a little tired. So he assigned the story to basically look into the Catholic Church cover-up and what was going on with this Father Porter, who kept getting transferred from parish to parish, and nothing was done about it. So, and I have to admit, I felt a sense of relief, particularly because the next year, we had another top editor come in, and I think he bowed to pressure from the Catholic Church and basically put the kibosh on reporting about Father Porter and other priests. And that ban, or that edict, pretty much stayed in place until a new editor, Marty Barron, came in and assigned the Spotlight team to look at to look into the matter more deeply. And that, of course, is the subject of an Oscar-winning movie, Spotlight. And so I'll stop there. Catherine, why don't you continue your story?
Well, it's not hard for me to identify the most important story I ever reported and wrote. And that was on 9/11. It was a story that I never expected to happen, and was not expected, I think, to cover by those some people back in the newsroom. But on the morning of 9/11, I was a fashion columnist for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. I also did feature stories that from time to time that had nothing to do with fashion, but most of my job was as a fashion columnist, and that involved traveling to New York City twice a year for New York Fashion Week. It was several days into Fashion Week, and first thing in the morning, and I had the television on, and on the screen was the first word of the first plane going into the first tower, and it looked bad, so I phoned the features editor. I phoned the editor of the newspaper, and I phoned my features editor and said, gee, there's a big fire in a tall building here. Do you think I should go? And she said 3 words, go, 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 ever louder, ever more urgently. So I did. There was a staff photographer from the newspaper with me, and we were together for part of the morning and separated for most of the morning. But it was a story that was difficult to file that day. There was very little phone connection. So when I had some pieces of some observances to file, I did the And if I saw someone talking on their telephone, I knew that they had a connection. So I did the praying hands thing and waved a $50 bill. And that morning, I must have done that 5 or 6 times, I guess, throughout the day. And only one person took the money. And that was a clerk in a bodega down there. The rest of the people hung up their own personal call, which was important that morning, and handed me their telephone to use. I thought it was that kind of a morning, I guess. But and I've written about it. I've written about it from time to time. I speak about it every September because there is a certain perspective from the reporters that were on the ground and near to the tragedy at the towers that morning, and frankly, all that week. That the rest of the world that viewed that event on television cameras that were mounted on top of the tall buildings in Midtown and showing the burning towers or the collapsing towers at a distance of 4 miles with very little sound, no smell, and no sense of feeling at all that you can't get, that they don't have. And I really feel like eyewitness accounts of that day are incredibly important to tell and to retell and to remind listeners. I give an example, and that is the dogs in New York City. There's many different estimates of how many dogs there are in the boroughs, in the 5 boroughs in Manhattan. There's rhinestone pooches being carried around in Fendi bags, and there's dogs in Greenwich Village at the windows and on the sidewalks, and there's feral dogs roaming the alleys. There are hundreds of thousands of dogs in Manhattan. They had the smell of fire in their snouts, and they had, for hours, they had multiples of wailing sirens in their ears, and they are not designed to tolerate that. So yeah, that morning I was bit by a German Shepherd, which drew blood, and frankly, everything was so colossal that day that a dog bite was nothing. So I stayed on. Well, you couldn't get off the island anyway for another couple of days, but I stayed on through the week and did the after stories, and they were not as immediate, but the pathos of the after stories of the searchers who were going around the city posting flyers of lost loved ones, contrary to all reality, that everyone knew that there were no survivors. But they went out every day, and they stayed out all day with reams, armloads of flyers. They tacked them everywhere, on every single surface, on bus stop poles and newsstands, on fencing, on scaffolding. They were even tacked to the insides of the stall doors of public toilets. And it was a sad thing. I'm sure, at some point, they gave up this unimaginable hope and faced reality. But that was a very moving part of the story. So yes.
I remember going by Ground Zero a few years after that, because it was still a big hole in the wall.
Yeah.
I can't imagine being there at the time. And the reason why I was going by Ground Zero is because I was researching the book about the pharmaceutical industry, and I was meeting with an assistant prosecutor in the New York State Attorney General's office, because she was the one who had sued this drug company for misrepresenting data and for basically defrauding consumers and doctors about a best-selling drug. And she was an amazing woman, but her office was literally a couple blocks right at the bottom of Manhattan, a
Yeah.
couple blocks from Ground Zero. And I remember going by there to interview her. She was, yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted
I
to
was
add,
going to ask, were they excavating at the time or rebuilding yet or not?
No, not in, this was in 2003, and it was just a hole in the wall. They hadn't decided what they were going to do. So, yeah, and then with, there was huge fencing around it because they didn't want anybody to.
I gave a talk one September. I talk about this every September to whoever will listen, audiences, wherever I am. But in one of the talks afterward, I always ask if anyone has any comments or questions, or if anyone lost a loved one in the audience that day. And this elegantly dressed man, silver-haired man, gingerly raised his hand. He stood up and I said, did you lose someone? And he said, no, but he was deeply moved about something. And I said, well, tell us, what do you have to tell us? Well, he was the owner of a company that designed mechanicals in the towers. And he said he was heartbroken, even years later. He was heartbroken at what happened. But he told this story. He said on the day after the towers fell, he got a call from the rescuers, and they asked for his designs, mechanical drawings and designs, thinking it might help them dig through the rubble or find people or whatever. And he took it to the office of whoever owned the World Trade Center at that time. I think part of it was the Port Authority, I guess. And he handed over the designs, and he said, are you going to rebuild on this site? And the man took an index finger and pounded it on his desk and said, we start tomorrow. And I have somewhat mixed feelings about that. I think that I understand the value of lower Manhattan real estate. I get it. But I also don't understand putting up office space, retail space. Maybe there's a Starbucks in there. I have no idea, because you wouldn't see that at Gettysburg. You wouldn't see that at any other revered American battlefield. So, yeah, I think that's not what I would have preferred to happen on the site. Having said that, the new tower is magnificent. I will say that, and the memorials and all that is done beautifully, really. So there you go. So, Alice, can you tell us a little more about the Pharmaceutical Story?
Well, as I said, I got to interview this. It all started because I had been doing research in the 90s when I was at the Boston Globe about the chief of psychiatry at Brown University, who was accused of financial misconduct, and there was some, his department was getting money from the state of Massachusetts for research that wasn't being conducted. Anyway, I wrote a number of stories about that. And then I'm reading in the New York Times a couple years later that the New York State Attorney General's office is suing GlaxoSmithKline and about a drug trial whose lead investigator was the same chief of psychiatry at Brown University. So I almost fell off my seat, and I realized, it's like, whoa, how can this happen? But Dr. Martin Keller. And so I reached out to the assistant prosecutor, who was an amazing woman, Rose Firestein, who was legally blind and walked with a cane so she could get around lower Manhattan. Anyway, so I realized there was a great story here in how two women a whistleblower, the whistleblower at Brown, who initially put me on to Dr. Keller's misdeeds, and the prosecutor, how they helped expose the deception behind the making of a best-selling drug. And it told a larger story about the problems that still face us in the pharmaceutical industry, where they try to market drugs and make them look safer and more effective than they really are. And then, of course, happens again and again. And I don't know if anyone's seen the recent Dope Sick series on Hulu, but that's about the opiate epidemic and how Purdue Pharma misled the American public, much like GlaxoSmithKline did with its drug in the 90s. So this unfortunately does keep happening.
Well, the second story that I can point to that I feel it took an effort to get and hopefully had a lasting impact was most of the stories I did late in my career were insouciant fun little pieces about celebrities and fashion. But when I was handed the fashion beat at the merger of the Journal and Sentinel, I sort of brokered a deal with the top editor there and said, could I from time to time do serious feature stories that had nothing to do with hemlines and high heels? And she waited a long few beats before she nodded her head. So this one story was about three Hispanic middle school girls from a private middle school. And I say private, I'm sure they were all on scholarships of some sort or assistance. And they were from poor families in Milwaukee. But every summer the school sponsored a mission trip for these girls, and two adult administrators from the school would take a group of girls down to what is arguably third world America for, I think it was about 10 days. It may have been as long as 2 weeks to do good works down there and sort of see another slice of life that they were not familiar with. So I went with them and a photographer to a small town in Mississippi, town that time forgot, almost lost in the cotton fields in July in the Yazoo Delta. And the one girl was incredibly successful. She went on to receive a degree in dentistry from a private university. The second girl was beautiful, absolutely beautiful, and she had her entire future mapped out. The third girl, finally on about the fourth day of the trip, when I was wondering if I really was going to have a story, because the story was about how this experience of helping others less fortunate than you, how that impressed on these young girls, and hopefully that they would take back home and to their friends. And the third girl was just wonderful. She was sitting on a stoop crying. She was covered with mosquito bites that she had scratched and were bleeding. And I asked her how she was doing. Stupid question. She wasn't doing well. And she said, I just want to go home. But over the course of the next few days, she sort of found herself and came out of herself and out of her homesickness. And she went on to high school, to college. She's now one of the top administrators and educators at that school. And I can't help but think that that was one of the experiences that showed her she had more spirit, more strength, and more fortitude to pursue a goal than she ever thought she had. So that was my second story.
Great story.
Yeah.
Great. You all have touched on a few topics, but there's something that keeps coming back to me. Those of us not in the journalism world, we constantly hear and value the importance of free speech and freedom of the presses and all of those things. in both of your cases, but Allison in particular, yours, what I heard was the potential that we don't really have a free press because people within the press can discriminate and choose what stories they're going to talk about and what they think are important and aren't important, or what is against their religion, so they're going to suppress it. That's very disconcerting to me as a citizen. And Catherine, you and I've chatted on occasion, and you've shared with me sometimes when you felt that your reporting was somewhat brushed aside because of your gender, or you know, whatever was going on in the newsroom at the time, or what the business situation was, or what the policies were at the time. I'd be curious to hear from you both how some of that played out, and bring some gender discrimination into that, because I know you both experienced that.
Right, right. Well, why don't I start? It isn't easy, particularly when Catherine and I were coming up as reporters, being women, because the field was dominated by men. There were definitely women reporters and editors, but they were not, most of them were not in positions of power. And in particular, for my first job at the Miami Herald in the early 80s, I think, you know, with Miami back then, believe it or not, was a pretty sleepy little southern town. And all of the editors, with the exception of one, were men. And I have always been an assertive reporter and outspoken. And when I would speak up about what, you know, how my stories were played, or if I felt that they were underplayed, I could tell they didn't always appreciate my opinion. And in fact, as one friend said, when I was trying to understand why I was having trouble communicating with my male editors, he said, well, they see you as a brassy northern broad. And that, of course, became the title of my my memoir, Brassy Broad. But it went beyond that. Even at the Boston Globe, you know, when Ben Bradley Jr. suggested that I be given a berth on the Spotlight team, this was in the 90s, before they did their big investigation of the Catholic Church. And the editor of Spotlight at the time was disconcerted. And he said, you know, he didn't think I was a team player enough. And that was code for I was too independent-minded as a woman. And in those days, Spotlight, and I think even now, they, you know, they allowed one woman on the Spotlight team just to show how diverse they were. And instead they picked someone who was younger and more compliant to be on the Spotlight team. So, you know, I think that, but you can't let that stuff stop you. And you just have to keep plowing ahead and persisting in the face of that kind of gender discrimination. And what Elizabeth said about free speech, and yes, it does very much matter who the editors are and who's in control. And that certainly was why it took the Boston Globe a full decade before they really looked into the cover-ups by the Catholic Church about the crimes of their own priests in molesting children. But once they got rid of that particular editor and another editor came in, yes, they did do the investigation. So it is a balancing act when you're a reporter, because you have to pick your battles and know when you should speak up and when you should protest a particular editor's decision to maybe not run a story, and when you should let other people fight your battles for you. I always are a little bit too much on the side of fighting my own battles, but it all worked out in the end. What about you, Karen?
Looking back, I think it's fairly easy to identify some instances of overt sexism and gender bias, as well as oblique bias. And I can point to a time, and this is a long time ago. This is light years ago when I was a cub reporter at the St. Louis Globe-Democrat. Actually, I was not a reporter. I first started on the copy desk there. And this was the day that Thomas Eagleton had to resign from the presidential ticket of George McGovern. Thomas Eagleton, it had been revealed that he had been hospitalized with electroshock therapy and some other things. And that just wasn't going to fly on a presidential ticket. And Eagleton represented Missouri, so it was a huge story in St. Louis. I got the headline. The headline was in at least 72-point type, which is big. It's like war. It could have been 96-point. I have no idea. But this was back in the days when we counted every letter to see if a headline fit across however many columns it was supposed to be across. And I had all long words: McGovern, presidential, nomination, Eagleton. Was fiddling and fiddling and fiddling with all these words, and the publisher and the editors were standing right behind me, and they were impatient. Finally, the publisher of the paper picked up this scrap paper I was frantically doodling on and checked one headline. It got sent through the pneumatic tube under the streets of St. Louis to the basement of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, where the first edition was printed. And I promptly went out with my friends to have a cigarette and a bourbon old fashioned for my dinner. And when we came back, the city editor called across the newsroom, "Underhill, get over here," which never happens. He was a small, mild-mannered, courtly city editor of all things. So I went over there, but I didn't approach too closely. It pulled a chair into the middle of the newsroom. Luckily, it was not on rollers. And he said, "Come closer." And I came closer. He said, "Get up on the chair." And I thought, what is going on? And I had two thoughts. I can either get up on this chair and stand on this chair and do what he says, or I can quit. So I got up on the chair. You know, I was like 23 years old. He handed me the aborted first edition of the next morning's newspaper. He said, at a high volume, "I have never in my career had to stop the presses as I did tonight. Read the headline that you wrote." Well, unfortunately, the publisher had checked a headline that never should have been published. And it was, "Eagleton withdraws from #2 position." And some jerk on rewrite in the back of the room hollered out across the entire newsroom, "Hey, Underhill, what is the #2 position?" I was totally mortified, just completely mortified. And yet I knew enough to know I could use that perhaps as a bargaining chip to get off the copy desk and get to a city-side reporting job, which is what I really wanted. I think, and Alison, I'm sure you can back me up on this, I think that we all experienced salary discrepancies, women did, between equivalent reporters that were males. But there was also this sense in my career that yes, that the editors that I worked for were on the softer side of the newspaper business. They were food editors, they were women's editors, they were society editors, maybe possibly religion editors or book editors, but definitely they did not rise through the ranks as city-side hard news editors. And likewise, women, especially young women, were sort of channeled into gender appropriate beats and assignments. And that's just the way it was. I had two marvelous role models. One was an Australian beautiful young woman named Kate Webb. And she left Australia, went to Vietnam, inveigled herself into a job as it was either UPI or Agence France Presse, to report on the Vietnam War. from the ground, from the jungle, which she did. She was fearless. And she got captured by Viet Cong troops and tortured and thrown in a pit and left there to die, and came crawling out after her obituary ran in the New York Times, and lived to tell. She was wonderful. And the other was the slot woman at the Globe Democrat, who was a single mom, 2 little kids. And on the day that President Nixon resigned, both AP and UPI ran retrospective stories on all of Watergate from the very beginning and how it happened. These stories had more than 100 names, characters in them. And for some reason, the wire services did not run the titles of anyone in there. And they took, Jean May was her name, and they put her in a private office. They gave her a pack of cigarettes, an ashtray, a lighter, probably a Coca-Cola, closed the door, and a couple of number 2 pencils. And within 90 minutes or so, she had attached the correct titles to 100 names. So Democrat Missouri, or Republican Connecticut, or special counsel to the president, or whatever. It was a magnificent use of her, the breadth of her knowledge as a newswoman. I've never forgotten it.
Yeah.
So,
There were a lot of amazing women that I worked with at the Boston Globe as well. So
yeah.
one of them was in a position of authority, and in fact, she was executive editor under the top editor, and it was her. It was Helen Donovan, and she was the son of. I mean, she was the daughter of Hedley Donovan, who I guess was the editor-in-chief of Time in his day. But Helen was a great editor. And I'll never forget when I wrote even before the priest abuse scandal, I broke a story about a study that had been done by a former priest now at Johns Hopkins and he surveyed 1,000 priests about their sexual proclivities, and discovered that a good 4 to 6% of them acknowledged having sex with minors. And less than half acknowledged not being celibate. Anyway, so I had written this story because it was presented, this study, at the American Psychological Association, which I attended, and I had written up the findings. And there was a real fight in the newsroom about whether even to print the story, and if they did print the story, where were they going to run it? Were they going to bury it in Metro or do it on Page One? And to Helen Donovan's credit, she said, this is a Page One story. And she was at that time the Page One editor. And she made the call that the story went on Page One, and it did. And that was in 1990. But there were a few male editors who were Catholic and were very upset that it was getting that kind of play. But she spoke up, and she had the end. The last word on it, and it ran on Page One. So there were some amazing women that I could look up to as well when I was going
And I
in other places.
I think women have come a long way. I mean, by the end of my career, I had worked for 2 women who were features editors. The assistant managing editor for features was a woman. The managing editor for Day, they called it, or features, was also a woman. Now, all 3 of these 4 of these women were unmarried and did not have children. So, and that throughout the years of my career was a factor.
Mm-hmm.
And if a woman wanted to rise above the level of reporter, that was, I won't say it was a prerequisite. I'll just leave that word hanging out there. But the publisher of the Journal Sentinel now is a woman. So so I do think, and women are scattered across the news side, business reporters, science reporters, court reporters, whatever, and doing remarkable, wonderful, award-winning work. So I don't think the playing field is quite level yet today. It may not be, maybe it may not be in terms of salaries, in terms of advancement and assignments. And women are getting there, almost there, I think. It's encouraging.
Yes, much better than it used to be. No question.
So there was a sort of a, and this oblique sexism in some of the assignments I got, and it's certainly in getting the fashion beat. My qualifications were stated like this when that beat came to me in the merger as a surprise. You dress pretty. That was it. That was entirely it. So okay. You know, I was sent to a woman's survival camp in northern Wisconsin, where we shot powerful bows and shot a shotgun and, you know, built fires and all that. And I'm sure there was chortling in the office about, yeah, Fitzpatrick, you know, the fashion writer, she's at this survival camp. And in fact, the picture that ran with my story was the exact instance when the first and only time I have ever discharged a firearm. And it was like a big shotgun. They were shooting at clay pigeons or something. And the instructor had told me, now hold this against your shoulder, which I forgot to do the last minute. So the picture is me falling backward with my mouth agape at the recoil from the shotgun. Really, really funny. But I was also sent to Kohler, Wisconsin. They had just come out with a new $10,000 shower unit called the Habitat. You could program it to be a jungle or jungle rain or tropical mist or whatever. And so I did get a weekend at beautiful suite in Kohler with my husband. But, you know, the idea of, and they sent a photographer. So showing, you know, discreetly Fitzpatrick in a shower or Fitzpatrick getting a mud massage, you know, was considered just real printable. And I look back on that and I think, I maybe should have said no.
Yeah.
There we go.
Alison, you've been very respectful in how you address the issue of religion in the workplace. As a Jewish woman working in particularly a place like Boston with more Irish Catholics than probably anywhere else in the world, except possibly Ireland. Was that a major problem for you, or was it just with respect to this particular story that obviously it would bring it up because it was the Catholic priest and that kind of thing, but just in general in the workplace, was that a problem?
Well, I remember when I first came to the Globe, there were not that many Jewish editors and reporters. There were some, and we did feel marginalized. In fact, I remember we even had a meeting at one point because we felt marginalized. You know, we weren't in positions of authority, and also there were a lot of Christmas decorations all over the place. And so I remember somebody, based on that meeting, wrote up a memo and sent it to management. And as a result, all of a sudden there was a menorah because it was right around the time of Hanukkah and Christmas. And so they did put up a menorah next to the Christmas decorations. But other than that, not much had changed. But I think it's better now. I mean, there was no question that the Boston Globe was a bastion of, it was run by Boston Brahmins who were Protestant and the Taylors, and most of the top editors were Catholic.
Right.
But, you know, other than the priest abuse scandal story, there really wasn't, I never experienced discomfort in, and of course that first study that I didn't feel any overt discrimination because I was Jewish. The gender thing was a larger issue, I think.
I think a lot of us who are not in the journalism world. We tend to think of journalists just running all over the globe, reporting on stories, and I don't think we stop to think of the mechanics or the politics, or have an appreciation for the process, and what the journalists go through besides getting beaten up while they're doing the story, or getting kidnapped or whatever that happens to actually make the press. This has been really interesting, and I want to thank you both. I'd like to ask you one last question, which may or may not be as relevant today as it might have been 10 or 20 years ago. But um, if a young woman came up to you today and said they were thinking of going into journalism and would like your opinion, their personality aside, just based on your experiences, what would you tell them? What would you advise them to do or not do? Or, what good words of wisdom would you have to give them?
Well, first of all, journalism is a wonderful profession. It's a wonderful career. You constantly meeting new people, you're learning new things. It's the best career as far as I'm concerned. And so I would never dissuade someone who was interested in journalism from going into it. The need for good journalism, it's never been more important than now, given the flood of misinformation that's all over the web, the internet, and all the conspiracy theories and disinformation that's floating around. So credible journalists are more important than ever. It's probably more difficult today for journalists to break in, but what I tell someone who's interested is go to a good journalism school, or if you're at a liberal arts college, work for your student newspaper, because you need to get those clips. You need to get either professional clips through internships or for your daily newspaper, so that when you're graduating, you have good clips, whether it's radio, broadcast, or print, that you can send out. Because, obviously editors are not interested in your written assignments. What they want to see is what you've actually published. And, the advice I have now is the advice I told my students, and that I gave myself, is you just have to persevere. You just have to be very persistent and not give up. And, if you are a good writer and a persistent and talented reporter, you will eventually land a position. Several of my students have done very well after graduating from West Virginia University. One got a job with a Mountain State Spotlight, which pioneers with or partners with ProPublica. Another works for the Charleston Gazette Mail, which is the best newspaper in West Virginia, and they're doing great work. And they got it by through internships where they got professional experience and where they had clips that they could then show an editor. And one's a woman, one's a man, but they're both doing very well. And what matters is their professionalism and their perseverance.
That's great. Congratulations to them.
Yes, they've done very well.
Catherine, what about you?
So I agree with every single solitary word that Alison said. First of all, and especially go to a really good J school. There's a number of them, and there's no better training to launch you on a career in journalism. And secondly, my advice today would be to try to tailor your studies to either digital journalism, photojournalism, electronic journalism, one of those. Print journalism is bleeding staffers today, and I don't see that turning around. Possibly it will, but I wouldn't stake a career on newsprint journalism at all. And I did have high school and college students shadow me at work, and that was fine, and it's kind of fun for them and fun for me. But really, my advice that I leave them with, and I have this little piece of paper printed out, is more technical. And it starts off with, so you've written a story, and you're ready to turn it in or see if it gets published or whatever. Well, what you have isn't a story. It isn't a manuscript. It isn't an essay. It isn't an article. It's a hot mess because you wrote it and you maybe breezed over it once and that was it. So go back and number one, trim it by whatever, 20%. Number two, take a look at every verb, find a better verb for most of them. Number three, circle all the ly words. Those are adverbs. They're annoying. Number four, watch your direct quotes. And if you're paraphrasing, just make sure it sounds like what the people said, instead of what you want to tell through their own voice. And lastly, trim another 10% before you turn it in. So more nuts and bolts, I guess, advice. And with the right training, and as Alison said, fortitude, persistence, perseverance, starting out small. I started at the Hannibal Courier Post. It's not where I thought I'd start, and I only stayed 7 months, but it was invaluable because I did just about everything there. So that's my advice.
All good
And
words
if you
of
do
wisdom.
go into journalism, you will have a remarkable life and a very fulfilling one, I think.
It certainly sounds like it.
Yeah.
I just want to take a second and thank you both very, very much for your time today. Hopefully you each have your book there. You could hold them up and show them to the world. Bedazzled Ink was thrilled to receive your manuscripts and quite excited. And it was a pleasure working with both of you to publish your books. And we look for a long life for your books and an even longer relationship, publisher and author. And we thank you so much for all you have done in your life as journalists and all that you're doing now as authors. We have the great respect for you. So
thank you as well,
Thank you.
Liz.
oh no, it's our pleasure. It's always our pleasure.
Do we have time for any questions?
Oh, that's right. Now, we do have a chat room. Do we have some questions? I know Carla just had a comment that I wanted to read. It says, you both have persevered as fabulously brassy women in your careers.
Mhm.
What an affirmation, your books being discussed today. Brava. Dee Dee Montgomery is with us today. She's another one of our authors. Dee Dee writes books that are somewhat regional in nature and from Oregon State, but really can be applied to anywhere in the world. And so she has some, I would recommend you looking her up if you have an interest in that. My question is, what's next for you on the writing front for both of you?
Well, I'm actually working on a historical novel.
Oh, wonderful. How exciting.
Yeah, it's I don't know if you've ever read Ivanhoe.
Yeah, of course.
But it's, it's about a knight in medieval England who rescues a beautiful Jewish healer, Rebecca, from being burned at the stake as a witch.
Right.
Well, I'm writing the sequel to it. It's about
fantastic.
I'm writing the sequel to Rebecca's story after she and her father flee England to go to Cordoba, Spain, because that's where his brother is, and what they encounter there, and some of the anti-Semitism they have to deal with in medieval Spain.
That's really different. That sounds fascinating.
So that's what I'm working on now.
That would be a fun book to research, let alone.
Yes, exactly. Although I think writing fiction is so much harder than nonfiction, I have to say.
Well, and they sometimes they say truth is stranger than fiction sometimes.
Right.
Catherine, what about you? Do you have another book in you? I'm sure you do.
I might. I don't know about book length, but what I've started working on is for family, I guess. And it is stories of people in our lineage, the heroes and the villains, I guess, on both sides, on the Fitzpatrick side and on the Underhill side. And it's really fun. What prompted it was a chance discovery of Duchess of Leslie, I think her name was. And she was, beautiful, wonderful, young, wealthy English woman. And she was on the Titanic. She was on the first lifeboat that got off the Titanic. And they put a seaman on the lifeboat as well, back in the early minutes of the lifeboat launching, where they were more organized. And this gal was so assertive that the seaman just turned over the tiller to her. She ordered them to row away from the ship. She knew there would be a sucking down when the ship went down. And she was marvelous on the way to the Carpathia. And she kept everyone calm, et cetera, et cetera. She's all over the internet. And that got me started on. Then I found an Underhill ancestor who was like the Clyde of Bonnie and Clyde in Oklahoma and places like that during the Dust Bowl, and went around robbing banks and systematically killing people. So it's been really fun doing that. And it won't be book length. It's probably not publishable, but it's sure a fun project after you've finished 3.5 years of wrenching memoir. Yeah. This feels lighter, more buoyant, I guess. Fun. Yeah, more fun.
Well, I think a lot of historical novelists, fiction or nonfiction, quite often start with someone in their family. Mm-hmm. They just happen to be researching someone. I have an aunt who was in World War II. She was in the army. And it got me researching her, which then got me researching women in World War II, which then got me researching other things. And all of a sudden, oh my goodness, I had this idea for this great novel that all started just because I was curious about her. So you may find that as you look at your villains and your heroes, that
it could grow. It could grow.
Yeah.
Dee Dee just asked, I think it was Dee Dee, just asked a good question in the comments. Mm-hmm. And it had to do with the difference between writing a memoir versus writing any other kind of nonfiction or fiction.
That's a very good question. Yeah, because I think that writing memoir in terms of its structure is actually more like writing fiction. You have to create scenes and dialogue. Of course, I did that with my nonfiction books as well, trying to resurrect dialogue and create scenes, but using the structure of fiction. So because it just makes things so much more readable. The only difference between memoir and fiction is that memoir is truth-telling and is truthful, and fiction, of course, is your imagination. We're not James Frey.
Very true. When I was writing one of my fiction story, I was writing about a story about a little girl one summer in the 1950s, and I was stuck. I was writing it as nonfiction. I was going to write about the people in my neighborhood, my childhood neighborhood when I grew up, with this little girl as central, and using the real people, the real families in the neighborhood. And it was flat. It was absolutely flat. And then one day, a light bulb went off over my head, and I thought, I was writing about the little boy next door, and we shared baseball cards and played with Lincoln Logs together, and it just wasn't going anywhere. And I had this inspiration. I can make this little boy a daredevil. I can make him use coat hangers and rip up his mother's sheets and make wings and climb up to the roof of the house and jump off. I can make him decorate his bicycle with Christmas lights and plug them in, and then ride the bike down the icy driveway and pull the plug half out of the wall and burn down the garage. And it was, I loved it. It was freeing. It was wonderful. And it didn't involve the introspection that and self-analysis that my memoirs have done. So
I think memoir writing can in some way be a little bit cathartic.
No
forcing-
question.
Yeah, it's forcing you to deal with issues that you may or may not have planned on dealing with. And so I think having a good healthy balance between memoir writing and just having some fun, writing some fiction or some nonfiction, but that's not all that in depth for you personally is not a bad thing. Having a good combination. I mean, we learn from memoirs. We learn from other people's memoirs. I think what Dee Dee says is absolutely right. She has a nice balance too. She writes both memoir and fiction. So Dee Dee, you could comment here what you think that balance has brought to you in terms of what you've written. But anyway, just me shooting off some steam here. Have we had some more questions? Carla wrote, I think, Catherine, I think your family stories intended for your family would be of interest to so many of us. So she's pushing for you to write your villains and heroes book for everyone. Maybe you can have some fun with it and expand it with your child running around with his lights on his bike or something. I don't know.
Do it, Cuff. She writes. She would know. Carla has traveled the world. She spent almost 6 months on the Queen Mary, going most of the way around the world. She's been, I think, to 4 corners of the world, a lot of adventure travel, and written beautifully about the places and some of the people that she's been. So she does know. The piece I wrote is a very short piece. It was the most fun piece I ever wrote in my life. It was a piece about an author. It's called Author Wear. An author, before leaving the house to give an author talk. And she's in her closet and she's trying on and ripping off and trying on. And this is not right. And that's not right. And this doesn't work. And this needs foundational garments that that are architecturally designed that I don't have. And it was just, yeah, it was just really fun. So sometimes those first person introspective real life things can be a blast to write as well.
That's right. That's right. Well, I think, oh, hang on. Catherine, I'd be happy to chat about memoirs sometime based on my experience, but also now
Good.
owning the 300+ page memoir my mom wrote, but didn't intend to publish, although she published a different book. Both are powerful and meaningful. So I think down the road, memoirs probably end up being the most appreciated by family generations later, and they get to know who you were that otherwise they wouldn't know. So probably your books will be, at least your personal memoirs will be valued most 60, 100 years from now, when we're ash floating somewhere, I don't know. But anyway, I think that they also are really important today because we are in such a period of turmoil. And you talked about conspiracy theories and all those kinds of things. I think we have to have these books that talk about the truth, talk about our truth. So please keep writing, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you so much
very
for your time
Liz.
today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm sorry we've gone 5 minutes over. Take care.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care,
Bye.
everybody.